Hello, and welcome to Raider HQ After Dark. I'm your host, Raider. And in this video, I'm going to be doing the cervical spine, how it is rated. So that's going to be the video for today. So we're going to walk through basically how it's rated in the 38 CFR Part 4. And then we're going to go into the actual cervical spine DBQ and talk about that. And then we're just going to talk about how the fact that IBDS can still affect the cervical spine. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, and we are back. Okay, so let's go ahead and start out with how it is rated. Now, if you've already watched the thoracolumbar spine video, you're going to notice that a lot of this was already covered, but just for the thoracolumbar spine. As you can see, and as I mentioned in that video, I don't understand why they did this, but they combined the back and the neck into 10%. They just kind of mashed them together. And so I'm going to highlight the sections that exclusively talk about the cervical spine for what 10% is. Now, when you are imagining these ranges of motion, you have to imagine that your feet and your back and your neck and your head and all that stuff is up against a wall. And then you are leaning forward from that particular perspective. So how you would get 10% minimal, if you have painful motion of your neck, that will give you 10%. It's not listed on here, but it's the minimum requirement for painful motion. However, if your neck is not painful, then you would have to have a limited range of motion of forward. That means like trying to touch the chin to your chest. Forward flexion of 30 degrees, but no greater than 40 degrees. So obviously the gonometer thing would have to be used to kind of determine whether or not you meet that criteria. And then we come down here to, or a combined range of motion of the cervical spine that is greater than 170 degrees in all planes. And I'll kind of show you that on the DBQ, but no greater than 335 degrees. And then we talk about muscle spasms, guarding, or localized tenderness. This is the same. It's going to be the same on the DBQ down here. They have the same criteria as the lumbar spine. So all of this also can be true. So if you have muscle spasms, guarding, or localized tenderness not resulting in abnormal walking, gait means walking, or abnormal contour, spinal contour, which means curving of the spine. And then we have the or section of vertebral fracture with loss of 50% more of the height of the vertebra. So that's 10%. And then what's 20% for the cervical spine? So we have to do the same thing where we kind of filter this in. We go to right here. So 20% would be, once again, forward flexion. So your head's up against a wall and you're trying to touch your chin to your chest, that it can be greater than 15 degrees of ability to bend your head like that, but no greater than 30 degrees. And then we go here to the combined range of motion for the cervical spine is not greater than 170 degrees. And I'm sorry, I keep having to pause the video because I just have this horrible cough. And then we go down here, and this is also going to be true, or the same muscle spasms, guarding, that is enough to result in abnormal walking. And then we have another or here. So if you should have abnormal curvature of the spine, such as scoliosis, reverse lordosis, or kyphosis, which has to do with the neck and the head, or I think it's forward curvature, then you would be qualified for the 20%. So all of this is kind of the same. We just looked at different stuff on the thoracolumbar spine DB review. Now, where the uniqueness happens here is at the 30% review. Because the 30% review is exclusively for the cervical spine. The lumbar spine does not have a 30% evaluation. So for the cervical spine, forward flexion, that is trying to touch your chin to your chest, of the cervical spine, 15 degrees or less. Now, who might benefit from this? Individuals with spinal fusions would benefit from this. So if you've had a cervical fusion, you might qualify under the 30%. Or favorable ankylosis of the entire cervical spine. So ankylosis means I'm going to give you a lay term, but it means frozen, where your cervical spine would be frozen. Ankylosis kind of means frozen joint. So your entire cervical spine is in a favorable position. So what's a favorable position? Would be is if your head was straight up and down, right? Like if you put your back against a wall and your head against a wall, that would be favorable ankylosis, to where you couldn't bend it forward, but it's not bent in such a way that it's unfavorable. So unfavorable ankylosis is if you were able to bend your chin all the way to your chest and it was stuck like that, to where you're looking down all the time. That would be unfavorable ankylosis. So that's what the 30% would require. And obviously, for favorable ankylosis, this is not something that you as the veteran can claim. This has to be supported by medical evidence. Like, you have to have a doctor showing that, you're stuck in that position, that favorable position, but you're still stuck there, evidenced by, and then you'd say, like, I've had a complete, cervical, what would you call it? A cervical fusion, to where all the bones have been fused together. Now let's move on to 40%. So 40% would be where I was talking about unfavorable ankylosis of the entire cervical spine. So it's just, honestly, it's maybe your head's turned permanently to the left, or maybe your head's pointing downwards, but it's not in a neutral stance, to where it would be favorable, the best outcome. So yeah, this is the only caveat for this. All the rest of these are for the thoracolumbar spine. So this obviously has to be supported by medical evidence. And then we go into 50% is unique, in that 50% is only for the thoracolumbar spine. There's no cervical spine here. So technically, the highest rating that your cervical spine, your neck, can get is 40% without the thoracolumbar spine being included. So 40% is the highest that you can get on its own. Now, if you had both your thoraco and lumbar spine service connected, and both of them had unfavorable ankylosis, to where your spine is contorted in a horrible way, in a non-neutral way, to where you can do normal things, which is going to be subjective to the individual and the doctor. So in order to get the 100%, both the neck and the back have to be completely just ankylosed. So that is about it for how the cervical spine is particularly rated, how it's a little bit different than the thoracolumbar spine, how each of these have their own, the cervical spine has the 30% to itself, and the thoracolumbar spine has the 50% to itself. Now, I have historically granted a few people for cervical spine unfavorable ankylosis, but it had to do with, obviously, like, degenerative issues that prevented the neck from, it wasn't due to a surgery, because most surgeries will try to put you into a favorable ankylosis position if they have to fuse it. This had to do with degenerative processes that, the neck was unable to be, due to certain kinds of, locked kyphosis type things. And I mean, this is nothing that the rater themselves are going to be like, yeah, that I believe that to be true, the 40% to be true. No, I'm going to take whatever the doctor tells me at that point in time that they've checked the box for unfavorable ankylosis. So now that we've kind of went through it, let's go through the cervical DBQ. And we'll just kind of do a breakdown of this. So obviously, the DBQ is going to need to be filled out correctly. All the stuff, all the, and I'm going to talk a little bit about private DBQs also. These have to be, these have to be check marked in the correct fashion. Were you seen in person? And now, in person can also be telehealth, so just keep that in mind. Um, but yeah, how was the exam conducted via telehealth, whatever? Were evidence that was reviewed. Now, for all of you that are doing private DBQs for your neck, the records would have to be reviewed and they would have to list out what records. The Salisbury VA Medical Center treatment from this date to this date. That's what I was given access to. Private chiropractor records, like even if this is a private DBQ, especially, they need to list that out. So that way, the rater, when they do their authenticity and credibility review, that they can see how would this examiner have known, that this is something that is either related to service, like if you're trying to get it service connected, or if this is an increase, how did they make the determination if they didn't have access to, say, diagnostic imaging like x-rays, MRIs, things like that? So if you're doing a private DBQ for either trying to get it service connected or increase, the evidence review section must be filled out completely, what you gave them access to. Now, the right hand and left hand dominant, this is really important, maybe not for the neck, but for the radiculopathy. Ambidextrous might seem like it's an advantage, but it's not, because something always has to be the dominant hand whenever you get into when you get into peripheral nerves, you'll have the major and minor. That's what they mean. Like major means dominant, minor means non-dominant. So both can't be major. So you can't try to cheat the system to get the 50% for both. One's got to be the minor type situation. So now when we come here to the diagnostic section, okay, this is the worst thing you can see if you're trying to get something service connected. So keep that in mind. If they put this down, they don't need to fill out anything else on this DBQ. If the examiner finds there to be no current diagnosis, that's it. The DBQ is dead. I mean, you'll find a signature down at the bottom, but there's no reason for them to, from like a legal standpoint, there's no reason for them to fill out anything else because you don't have a current diagnosis, which also means that they're not going to do a medical opinion if you're trying to get it service connected. Now, the ankylosing that we were talking about, this is what I want to, I'm hoping for that when we're looking for some of these higher ones, when we start talking about ankylosis, this is not something that can be inferred. We need to see ankylosis. Sometimes they'll put it down here as an additional diagnosis, but we need to have some objective qualifying that your injury is in fact ankylosing in nature. I'm going to go back to my IVDS video. You still need to meet criteria for IVDS whenever, if the examiner picks IVDS, then they have to fill out all the sections of the DBQ. So if you're doing a private DBQ, and I'm just going to talk about IVDS for a second, then they need to come down here and there is a section. Let me just Control F and go to incapacitating episodes. So if you're doing a private DBQ and you're claiming the neck condition related to IVDS, then the examiner has to fill out this section. Do they have IVDS and do they have this? If the examiner says that you have IVDS on a private DBQ and they don't fill out the question 10 section here, the DBQ will be deemed insufficient. Now, the rater's supposed to go back and they're supposed to actually get clarification from the examiner, but sometimes they don't. I'll just be honest with you. So you want to make sure that if you are doing IVDS for for anything, for the lumbar spine or the cervical spine, that you want to make sure that this is filled out completely, or else this DBQ is worthless. So that's all I wanted to do and talk about with IVDS for right now. Um, Now, or sorry, IVDS was this one. I apologize. So everything I just said, IVDS for this one. Now, if IVDS is found, but it doesn't have incapacitating episodes, then what they like to do is they'll switch to this. Even if the examiner checks this box, the rater will still switch your condition likely to this, to degenerative disc disease. Now, when we have spinal fusions are important that if you're using like a private DBQ, you want to educate the rater that you have spinal fusions. And this goes back to when we're trying to when we're trying to justify the limited range of motion on these, right? Like if you tell me that you have neck strain, but you can't, like you have zero movement of your neck, I need to medically know why. So just keep that in mind. So if you're doing a private DBQ, accurate diagnosis do help. But medical history, this is a section that you really want to pay attention to, especially if you're doing private DBQs, or if you're doing VA DBQs even, because this is the section where they start talking about the course of your treatment, the course of your injury history, like how this thing worked out. Now, the reason why I like to review these things, both in a rating capacity and as a veteran capacity, is because I want to make sure that this history matches up with my evidence and my history. Because sometimes you can kind of catch the fact, and I've caught more times than I can count as a rater, where I'm like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. He's playing softball, but he's ankylosed in an unfavorable way. You need to explain that. You know, so just be careful, especially if you have a private DBQ. A lot of examiners like to just, I don't know, put something in here, but not think it through how valuable the information is and how it has to be dress. So just keep that in mind. Moving down here, does the veteran report flare-ups of the cervical spine? Now, this is important for many reasons. Number one, if this is true for you, then it has to be accounted for in multiple spots. That flare-ups have to be accounted for. However, what can happen is flare-ups are your opportunity, if you have them, to basically tell the examiner, oh, when my neck gets really bad, this is how limited the range of motion looks like. And the rater has to take that into account. So when we go into VBMS and we submit the basically all of the range of motion inputs that the examiner puts in the DBQ, we go with whatever, well, we put in every single one that the doctor lists, and then VBMS itself takes the worst one, the most limiting range of motion, which I'll assure you is always flare-ups, and we have to go with that. So as long as the numbers make sense, like the flare-up numbers aren't better than another set of numbers, because flare-up should be the worst case scenario, right? That's what they're intent to be. So if you review your range of motions and you notice that your flare-ups are actually better than, let's say, repeated use over time, you should readdress that, because flare-ups are supposed to be kind of the worst case scenario. So obviously have your examiner document the frequency, characteristics, precipitating, alleviating factors, all of this fun stuff associated with flare-ups. Now, this stuff right here doesn't matter to the rater, but other than to demonstrate that they reviewed your evidence, that, you know, it adds credibility and validity to the statements if the examiner kind of, you know, qualifies why you would have cervical spine flare-ups and kind of what they look like and how they look like. Does the veteran report having any functional loss, functional impairment of the joint extremity being evaluated? So what we're this is for the functional loss review, and I'll tell you right now, this is, I've never seen it marked yes, but I mean, it's there for a reason. Obviously, some veterans have it. Now we get into the range of motion section. So this is where the magic happens. Now, worst thing, actually, it's not the worst thing, but sometimes what you'll see is oh, their baseline movement is normal. So the baseline, like they have full range of motion normally. And then what can happen is some people get really freaked out about this because they're like, no, I've got limited range of motion. Remember back whenever I said that we'll take the worst limiting range of motion? It's almost never going to be the initial baseline range of motion measurements. So if they're all normal, that doesn't mean that you're all normal. It just means that your baseline range of motion is all normal. So please don't look at that and take that in the wrong context. Now, sometimes you can have abnormal range of motion. This is if your baseline has been, diminished to that point. So this is where these are what the baseline measurements are. So in order to be normal, you would have 45, 45, 45, 45, 80, and 80. That would be a normal range of motion where they said all normal. Okay. Now, if one of these, let's say this is 40, and the rest are 45, 45, 45, 80, 80, that would be abnormal because you are outside of the normal range. You're restricted in your range of motion. So let's talk about the 10%. Okay. So 10%, if you remember back, painful motion is a minimum 10% rating. So anywhere on this entire DBQ, if the examiner talks about you having painful motion, check. That counts. If the examiner checks any of these that have pain exhibited on range of motion, that counts. And it can be anywhere. It doesn't matter which range of motion we're talking about here. It could be the initial range of motion. It could be the repeated use over time range of motion. It doesn't matter. As long as range of motion is either reported, or I should say, painful range of motion is reported by you, or it's reported by the examiner to some degree, and it doesn't have to be all the time. They just have to check the box. Then that's what the 10% rating is. Now, the other 10% for the 10% rating is, remember how we were talking about forward flexion of the spine? Greater than 30 degrees, but no greater than 40 degrees. So if you come back here, and let's go back up to abnormal range of motion. So if this was true right here, oh wait, 80, 80, and you'll get to hear my keyboard again, guys. Have fun. So forward flexion, this is what we're looking for in a lot of these reviews. This is the portion of the DBQ that primarily matters to you. So forward flexion, no greater than 30 degrees, but no greater than 40. So 40 technically counts. So this would get you 10%, even if you had no pain marked. If there was no painful motion, this would get you 10%. So let's look at the other thing here. So what annoys me, we'll get to the bottom where it says spasms and stuff later on in the review, but when we come down here, or combined range of motion of the thoracospine, or combined range of motion of the cervical spine, no greater than 170 degrees. So what this means, and I don't think I explained this too well in the lumbar spine, is that you can have 5 degrees of difference here, and that equal 10%. But you need drastically reduced range of motion in everything else to equal 10%. So I mean like drastically. So like, let's say like 15, 30, 30, and let's do 40 and 40. So 40, 80, 90, 110, 20, 30, 40, 55, 60, 70. See, that's still too much. The combined range of motion, greater than 170 degrees, but no greater than 133. So actually that counts. So this right here, with how decreased this is down by like 30 degrees, reduced by 30 degrees, reduced by 15, half. This is half as effective. Because this crosses the 170 degree threshold right here, greater than 170 degrees, but no greater than 335. This level of impairment here equals 10% because of the overall combined number is greater than 170. But 5 degrees reduction with flexion equals 10%. So flexion carries a heck of a lot more weight than all of these other range of motions combined. So please keep that in mind. It's something I didn't really go into great detail about on my thoracolumbar DBQ, but this is when you're looking at both, that's what they mean. So the forward flexion portion carries the lion's share. So let's see what 20% looks like. So 20% looks like forward flexion of the cervical spine greater than 15, but no greater than 30. So let's do 25. So if you had 25 degrees, this would be 20%. So just based upon the forward flexion being down to 25 degrees, because we're looking at greater than 15, but less than 30, 25 is great. And for the cervical spine, the combined range of motion no greater than 170 degrees. Both of these are now true. 80, 90, 110, 55. Yeah. Actually, no, that's wrong. So we would have to go down here. Like, let's drop this down to 5. And I'd have to drop a few of these down to crazily low levels in order for this to be like, if this was 35, I'd have to be down here in this level of impairment in order to qualify for the 10%. You have to have drastic, and I mean drastic reduction in range of motion and everything else to have that combined value equal 20%. Or you can just have forward flexion be at 25 and you're good, right? So there's many different ways to get to the 20%. You can also have the muscle contour spasms, and I'll go to that here in a minute. Well, why don't I just do that right now? So if we come down here further and we get to the guarding muscle spasms, right? So does the veteran have any of these conditions? That's what the first question asked. Is there any positive objective identification of localized tenderness, guarding muscle spasms of the cervical spine? If they mark yes, the rater's expecting to see something down here. So if you have a private DBQ, they have to mark yes, and then they should mark something along here. This not resulting, every one of these that say not resulting is the 10% value. So localized tenderness, not resulting in an abnormal gait or abnormal contour. So what you would need to see here is no, this would be fine. One of these is fine. All you need is one of these to be checked and you get the 10%. But these are the ones that would be checked if to get that 10%. Okay, the ones that say not resulting in abnormal gait or contour. Now let's reset. Now the 20% rule. The 20% says that you need muscle spasms guarding that results in abnormal gait or abnormal contour, such as in all these things. Now, localized tenderness doesn't have the option. Localized tenderness cannot take you to 20%. You can only get the 10. So muscle spasms and guarding are what take you to the 20%. So you would have to do with resulting in abnormal gait or contour. One of these checked would get you the 20% muscle spasm or resulting in abnormal contour. Now, this, let me just scroll back up here. So that's basically what we're talking about for the 10, the 20. Now, the 30%, this is going to be decided in the range of motion section for the most part. So if we come back up here, sorry for the scrolly McScrollerstein here. Okay. So if the forward flexion was less than 15 degrees, so let's say 10, right? Because less than 10, then you get the 30% rating. None of these others matter anymore because if you notice, there's no combined down here in the 20, they talk about the combined range of motion, I should do this, combined range of motion to the less than degrees. That only counts up to the 20%. Once we get to 30, we're only talking about forward flexion. That's it. That's all that matters. So if you've got forward flexion that's bad, you should stick with that as your primary thing. However, if forward flexion is fine for you, then you have other options to stay 10 and 20. However, if forward flexion is fine for you, you will never get higher than 20% for your cervical spine. Let's just keep that real. And we're at 30 minutes already. I just like talking to you guys. So anyway, I better just keep this going real quick. So we have the different range of motion types, repeated use over time, observed range of motion was above it. These are just the same. We're just doing, the examiner's having you do different exercises in order to see what your range of motion looks like. But they're all going to progressively cause you to have lower and lower range of motion, with flare-ups being the final thing that they discuss. So we would expect to, if you had flare-ups marked above, we'd expect to see it down here. And then if there's pain, that would get you the 10% minimum, but the flare-ups themselves, this is going to be an estimated range of motion based upon lay statements of the veteran. So you don't need to go nuts backing it up, but just keep in mind, flare-ups can get you there. But if you talk about flare-ups as your extension endpoint, and that's 0%, well, it's not, the max you can get is 20%. The forward flexion is what they care about. So forward flexion, once again, is you taking your chin and trying to touch it to your chest. That's flexion. So please keep that in mind. Now, oh man, I'm going to have to do a separate video for the radiculopathy. Yep, it's going to have to be a separate video, guys. So I apologize for that. But that's about all I got for you today on this. I'll have to do the rest of the stuff for that. But this is the way it's rated, okay? And then if we want to talk about the, because we have the 40% here, unfavorable ankylosis, we would need to see ankylosis. So this is the ankylosis section that would need to be filled out for you to get higher than, well, you could also qualify for the 30% for the ankylosis with this, but you can also qualify for the 40% for the unfavorable ankylosis. So is there ankylosis? The answer would have to be yes. And then if it's favorable, that's going to be the 30%. And if it's unfavorable of the entire cervical spine, right? Unfavorable ankylosis of the entire cervical spine. If that box is checked, then that's 40%. And then if this box is checked, that's the 100%. So you have 30, 40, 100. And then we would expect to see some comments, but we're going to pretty much take the doctor's word on these. But that's about all I got for you today. Yeah, and I will do the radiculopathy next. I'm also planning on doing the MST stressor video. Like I said, I've got to do a little bit of work on, I got to do a little bit more research just because I want to make it clear. So, yep, that's about all I got for you today, Raider Nation. Raider out.